Hello and good evening, and thank you for joining in for the live chat after the book reading session. I will be here for the next 1 hour or so, waiting for your questions. I will be happy to reply and interact with you all, and I look forward to your questions if there are any. We have learned this evening um, the various facets of disaster preparedness, and we've learned how to create resilience in terms of better access to healthcare, higher healthcare, and early warning installations, transparent governance, air ambulances, medical infrastructure, and so on. If you have any questions, please do come forward. The live chat suggestions that you give us will help us grow. It will help us incorporate these details when we revise the drafts, and hopefully, it will go to policymakers and make a difference in legislation. That's the aim. If you have any questions, any suggestions, put them in here in the live chat box. Let's do our best. We have learnt in sufficient detail geological aspects of the calamities which triggered a watershed in disaster mitigation, so to say. The Asian tsunami caused by a mega Andaman Sumatra mega subduction earthquake had triggered the Asian tsunami, which was the the essential trigger to do a lot of thinking and introspection for mitigating the impact of calamities on human landscape. That came to be called disasters, and that came to be called disaster mitigation. So to prevent a severe impact, a debilitating impact of calamities on the human landscape is disaster risk reduction or disaster mitigation. Disaster management, on the other hand, was all about relief centered response. It could have been dispersal of food packets, medicines, clothes, shelter. But mitigation is about creating resilience and preventing or lessening the impact of calamities on the human landscape. I shall wait for your questions. Any questions, anybody? Island territories such as in Southeast Asia, it could be Indonesia, Polynesia, Micronesia, Lakshadweep Islands, Minicoy Islands, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Andaman Nicobar Islands. These are areas which are very geographically challenged and they are in need of emergency logistics. Like it could be for evacuation infrastructure like buses maybe, or mass transit systems which will help in evacuation. There are evacuating people in far-flung islands was an unthinkable challenge after the April 11th, 2012 earthquakes in the Indian Ocean, which triggered a tsunami alert. Tsunamis didn't happen, but except for some small local tsunamis. Three people died in Campbell Bay, the southernmost Indian territory in Great Nicobar in India. But then, if once a tsunami alert had been issued, the chief secretaries of island territories in Andaman Nicobar Islands and Lakshadweep were sitting and monitoring in the control room. But then the logistics of evacuating people in far-flung islands was neither had it been thought of, nor was it available. And helicopters are used for medical emergencies and for transporting patients to the nearest medical centers. But in terms of evacuation during a tsunami alert or an impending disaster, it was impossible. In Lakshadweep, to evacuate people in far-flung islands was considered a challenge. In Sri Lanka, traffic management between Colombo and Galle, that is the entire stretch of the Western Highway in Sri Lanka, became a nightmare because of everybody was rushing home. There were no traffic protocols, and similar was the situation in Banda Aceh in Sumatra. They are used to earthquakes in Banda Aceh, and everybody were reminded of the 2004 earthquake, Great Sumatra earthquake, and that triggered the Asian tsunami. But then the traffic jams created havoc on the roads in Banda Aceh. People were not able to go home despite the early warning, despite people knowing what the protocols, what has to be done. People were not able to go home. Similarly, in Colombo in Sri Lanka, the traffic jams were so hard that nobody could. It was unmanageable even for the cops. People could not go home. They were stuck in the traffic. And in Lakshadweep, I have covered this. That's why I know this. People were not able to be evacuated on time. There are no traffic problems in Lakshadweep or even in Andaman Nicobar Islands. In Maldives too, evacuating as a precautionary measure was very difficult. Though they have very advanced seaplane network and very good high-speed yachts, etc., evacuating people from the far-flung islands within a short period before an imminent tsunami is the nightmare for administrators, for the government officers. The buck stops there. People have to be, they are responsible for people's safety according to legislation. And once the standard operating procedure has kicked in place after the issuance of the warning or the early warning and forecasting, this much has to be done according to the SOP. People had to be evacuated, and these were the challenges. And a payload for a helicopter is a maximum of 5 to 8 people. And then another problem arose in Nicobar, at least. There was one overweight tourist that is in Great Nicobar, where the only island where tourism is allowed. This is not during the April 2012 disaster I'm talking about. On another occasion, when an overweight person, a visitor, had to be transported back, not on a medical emergency but on a routine flight, that person was actually scaled down on the records. The administrator said he was not as overweight on the records because otherwise the helicopter couldn't leave legally. So fascinating are these issues. So that person was so gleeful that he weighed lesser, at least on record, of that day. So being lean and mean and fit to travel on a helicopter in an island nation, and you can't travel with much luggage. So these are the issues in mass transit, in evacuation procedures, in standard operating procedures, uh, that we have to think about in island territories. In Micronesia, again, or in Polynesia, there is a problem of overweight. This could be because of sedentary lifestyle. This could be because of dietary, not the best recommended diets, etc. So that is when transporting them on a lightweight helicopter during evacuation becomes difficult. These are issues that we need to consider. And then like I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, there is a country called Bougainville near Tonga in Polynesia. An earthquake triggered tsunami in 2011, and all the mortalities were of children because children had not been trained for tsunami preparedness. The adults escaped to higher ground, but the children were not able to respond because they were not trained. So training vulnerable sections for disaster preparedness is of utmost and critical importance. There again, there are people who are living with mental health issues. They could be spastics, they could be quadriplegics, they could be mentally retarded children or even adults. They could be people suffering from cerebral palsy, or they might be hearing impaired, or they might be visually impaired. How do we, and the caregivers for these people are the ones responsible for their safety. How do we take care of people who are differently abled? How do we train them for first response, or how do we train them for disaster mitigation? These are mind-boggling issues which we have not found answers for. Then there are, and somebody else said there has to be livelihood security for the caregivers of people living with mental health issues. That is when they will have a stake in the safekeeping of their wards. This was again, this is considered a best practice, but we have yet to evolve protocols and define them in legislation. It needs a lot more of public participation. Your suggestions will be very welcome, because there are people who are living with people with disabilities, people with mental health issues. The caregivers will have a lot of suggestions and feedback to give, practical suggestions. They are the ones who have to be consulted. They are the stakeholders. I think that is a gray area we have still not found answers for. And see, another issue is the current pandemic. There are no protocols for, there are absolutely no protocols for the pandemic, so to say. It's an evolving situation. Uh, Most of us were very worried that the isolated groups in Andaman Nicobar Islands uh, would be very vulnerable to pandemic spread, to infections, because they're so isolated, they're genetically isolated, and they would be extremely vulnerable. Uh, there have been more than 5,000 positive cases, and suddenly, as COVID dropped on the mainland, it dropped in Andaman Nicobar too. I'm yet to go through a full, I've not yet done the article, so I'm not completely familiar myself with the situation in Andaman Nicobar Island. There is a question here: is Andaman Nicobar safe for a disabled person? Simply said, no. It is not just safe, it is not equipped, or it is not uh, compatible to the needs of physically challenged people, much less for people with mental health issues. Now, Andaman Nicobar Islands is a very geographically challenged place. Piers, wharfs, uh, and these are places where people have to access boats to go for inter-island. For day-to-day activities, they may have to go to Port Blair very often for either permits or to get some better medical health access or anything like that. So, and for that, they have to cross over from one island to another. Islanders have subsidized helicopter rides, possibly, but not if everybody can afford them. So many people travel and even they send cargo by boats and ships. It is not at all compatible to people with disabilities. Uh, the piers, the wharfs, the waiting areas, the boarding areas are just not compatible. No railings, no there are no slopes for the ramps for wheelchair bound persons. uh, Boarding a ship is quite a nightmare in the Andaman Nicobar Islands. And I don't know if there are any physically challenged people amongst the indigenous people in Andaman Nicobar Islands. I have some data about it, which has been published in my book. About from the data which I have procured from the Social Welfare Department has been published in the book, and in some chapter I don't recall, but we will see it at some point. We will be reading it. But what really is of concern is the pandemic. There are no protocols for the pandemic management in indigenous people in islands with a density of indigenous people. Let's put it that way. Similar is the case with Lakshadweep. There are some indigenous people, but I think in Lakshadweep they are integrated with the mainstream. It's in Andaman Nicobar Islands that the indigenous people are isolated. They are not allowed to integrate with the mainstream society, at least in Andaman, if not in Nicobar. So that is where people, if they are affected by the pandemic, how will they cope with it when they are so vulnerable, genetically weak? That's a very big issue, and protocols have not been drawn for cold storage of, for example, cold storage and supply chain management of vaccines. Will the vaccines be of utility to the indigenous people? How will they, and they're already endangered, they're not more than 400, 500 people. How will they react to a side effect of the vaccine? These are issues which have not been studied. There are no protocols. Anywhere, I think anywhere in the world for that matter, it's an evolving situation. Supply chain management of cold storage for vaccine supply. These are protocols that have to be defined in legislation in India. It is not enough to say it is a work in progress, or we cannot say it is evolving, because we are responsible. We have to be accountable. We cannot afford to lose a single indigene person from Andaman Nicobar Islands to the pandemic. Not a single person. Not that one person is more valuable than another. We can't afford to lose many people. But if it's an endangered population, all the more reason to protect them, demographically speaking. I remember, I'm myself a physically challenged person. I remember back in 2007, it was my first trip to Andaman Nicobar Islands. I had gone to do some 30 odd articles. I was whining that it is not at all compatible to people, to the needs of people with physical disabilities. I was bluntly told that if you're not confident of surviving here, don't come. That was how rude it was. And then, I mean, imagine if a physically challenged person has to go and stand in a line to buy a ship ticket. And there was an instance where I myself saw that one islander, a local native islander, was fighting with a visitor for a berth in a ship. Now, the person who was a visitor did not know that berths are not reserved in a ship for long distance travel. He or she, I don't remember, had bought a ticket and had occupied his or her berth, but had to fight with a local native islander who had also bought a ticket, and they were fighting for the berth on the ship. So again, there are a lot of gray areas, and that's how transparent governance is the key to disaster mitigation. And then there is a question of menstrual hygiene with indigenous women. For us landlubbers or mainlanders, we would think, how can indigenous people survive without menstrual and sanitary towels, for example? But no, the indigenous people have their own traditions. They move around naked. They utilize leaves for as sanitary towels. So there are ways and means which we do not know. Uh, it calls for a very deep anthropological study. Menstrual hygiene is a very big issue in disaster mitigation, and also reproductive health care is a very big issue. These are things which need to be studied and extrapolated, defined after discussions, and then recommended as best practice for legislation. It's a long journey. Why the mud volcano is more dangerous? The mud volcano is not so fatal as the real volcano. The real volcano comes up with lava, but the mud volcano is detrimental to the ecosystem because it destroys the ecosystem. Uh, Whereas the real volcano, with its lava pouring over a period of time, it helps revive and enrich the ecosystem. It has been studied and documented that volcanic lava lahars makes the area very fertile uh, over a period of time, not immediately. Immediately it destroys, but what destroys also helps create. Volcanic areas, if you know, are extremely biodiverse and very rich in, in terms of ecosystem. Hawaiian Islands is an example. They're very diverse in terms of biodiversity. They support a lot of bio and zoodiversity and revives, because maybe the nature of the lava flow or whatever, they bring back a lot of nutrition rich biodiversity. This is not the case with mud volcano. Mud volcano spews out the mud and it's hot, and it spews out the mud and the mud becomes lahars and they flow out, but it does not make it fertile. The mud volcano in Baratang in Andamans is destroying forests. It has been spewing and it's been emitting natural gas ever since the great Andaman Sumatra mega earthquake, and it is spewing a lot of mud. It's flowing a lot. There is a lot of mud flowing out of the volcano. It is destroying the forest. And similarly, there's something called the Lucy volcano in near Surabaya, near Juanda in Surabaya in eastern Java in Indonesia. It one day just blew out and submerged 16 villages in and around that Juanda place. There, a sulfur stream is emitting. Every 15 minutes, there is an emission of natural gas. I have seen that too, it's amazing. But it has destroyed the whole place. 16 villages were submerged, and the entire neighborhood or the immediate vicinity of it has gone infertile. It has become barren and it is completely toxic, the area. So mud volcanoes are not considered as fertile or as uh, benign as the real volcanoes. Benign in the sense that you can't call volcanoes benign, but they can contribute to fertility in the soil and in the long run. They make it very rich in terms of biodiversity, zoodiversity, as well as agrodiversity. That might not be the case with mud volcanoes. The Lucy mud volcano, wow, there is a contention regarding the Lucy mud volcano. The Indonesian government, as well as the villagers who lost their villages there, they accuse a mining company of triggering a deep down, some volcanic remnant or lava deep down in the subterranean fields, and which triggered a mud volcano, they say. But the company which was doing mining said no, this particular, there were the tubes, the subaltern tubes which were connected to some other volcanic system. The volcano exploded somewhere else east of Flores, and that triggered a the mud volcano spewing out in Java, they say, in their defense. But the mud is still flowing from 2006, 29th of May 2006. It is still emitting, and the mud is still flowing, and geological experts from around the world came in for a conclave, and they have determined that it will keep spewing mud till at least 2022. It's still spewing, that much we know. We don't know much more, but we know that it is still spewing. It has created havoc in the lives of people. People have lost their agricultural land, their lives, their shelter. Somebody's house just cracked open and its steam started coming out of the walls. So these kind of things have happened in the Lucy mud volcano area, and a sulfur stream is going out from there. Their water spewed out from the mud volcano, and the water is going, though it is not sweet water, it goes straight to the sea from there, within 5 kilometers range. It was a freshly carved out river system. But volcanoes and any geological upheaval changes terrain immediately, and it creates new geological features like this. The mud volcano now has become so big that it has become a crater, a caldera. So till the whole thing submerges and implodes, there is no hope. But then an Australian geologist, if I'm not mistaken, said that it will continue spewing mud till 2022. It remains to be seen. We are 2021, and it has created havoc in the lives of people. People have lost agricultural land, they've lost their shelter, they've lost their livelihood security. And they do, when as a visitor, when I went there and to take pictures, they pleaded with me to do something. The most I can do is write about it, publicize it. But I need best practices from pundits, so that I can only extrapolate it further. I hear that some people saying that tsunami water smells like petrol. Is that true? That's what we said in the chapter that I read. This is a matter of contention. People who have survived the tsunami, they say they definitely smelled mineral water, or they have tasted minerals or something chemical, definitely. But then scientists, an oceanographer who was the director of the National Institute of Oceanography in India, in Goa, said no, this cannot be true, because it's not the water that is coming from the deep ocean, but it is only the energy that is getting transmitted from wave to wave. There is no such thing as mineral content in the water, he said. Another scientist I have interviewed for the same issue was Dr. George Pararas Karayanis. He is a seismologist and a tsunami expert. He lives in Hawaii, Honolulu. And when I had asked him, he said tsunami waters is a three-dimensional affair. The energy pops up from the lithosphere or the ocean bed. It pops up like this, and then it spreads horizontally towards the coast or the sea surface. So it could be that the pressure and the chemicals from the lithosphere will also pop up in the energy, and then it transmits on the sea surface to the coast. So he says it is possible that mineral content can be transmitted, now apart from the waves and apart from the energy in the waves. Excuse me. But we don't know if that is. That's what there were two divergent opinions. But then there was also a notion which we don't know, we can't confirm. There was a report that there was a lot of titanium deposited on the coast of Tamil Nadu in India. After the tsunami, it was discovered. But again, both the director of the National Institute of Ocean Technology and the director of the National Institute of Oceanography said there were no titanium deposits on the Tamil Nadu coast. Perhaps it was not documented because there was such a deluge of information that it was such a challenge to mitigate the impact of the tsunami. So perhaps one or two things could have been overlooked, but these things came about. These things kept evolving and it kept popping out. For those of us who were on the lookout for this kind of information, it came about. We don't know. I'm not sure. This was what I heard, I read, and I tried to cross check, and I was given this answer. Uh, But I have two, three survivors told me that it smelt of kerosene or petroleum products, kind of thing. It sounds very plausible that mineral content from the ocean floor or the lithosphere can mix with the tumult of the tsunami waters, and when somebody is drowning, like Miss Radha Raj, she drowned thrice into the water and she came back. And when we read her full first person account in, I think in chapter 7 or chapter 8 about tsunami survivors, there she will say, it was like a huge washing machine, and she went down, she was swallowed by the ocean thrice, and she was propelled up again, and during the third wave apparently the poor thing was pushed at jet stream speed towards the coast. Such was the terror she felt. uh, I mean, in first person her account is really scary. uh, but yes, so with it needs, maybe the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center or the USGS has some more answers regarding mineral content in the tsunami waters. It's an article that we need to explore. There is another question. About 80% of the tsunamis occur in the Pacific Ocean's Ring of Fire. Is that true? This is again a little polemical. You can't say yes or no very clearly. Pacific Ring of Fire is prone to a lot of geological activity. There is a very frequent occurrence of earthquakes, and because the earthquakes are very frequent, the seismic energy released is smaller when compared to the mega subduction earthquakes. So it is the mega subduction earthquakes which create the tsunami, usually in a seismic trigger. Otherwise, it could be a landslide and things like that. But if it is not a mega subduction earthquake, the chances of the tsunami are lower. Uh, and there are many islands in Micronesia, Polynesia, which are not sitting on tectonic plates. Rather, they may be coral islands in a vast island ecosystem. So those which are not seated on tectonic plates will have only corals as their base, and they will not perhaps trigger a mega subduction earthquake. So there is not so much of tsunami. Even if there is, it's a local tsunami because it's a smaller subduction earthquake, and because of the frequency, the intensity of the subduction earthquake is perhaps not so big. So that's why there are frequent tsunamis in the Pacific Ring of Fire. I hope that answers your question. It's very interesting. This guy comes up with extremely interesting questions. It's very fascinating. Do tsunamis have any positive effect? This was an experiment in Andaman Nicobar Islands. One island called Trinket Island near Komorta in the Middle Nicobar Islands was trifurcated by the tsunami. The water inundated, land got trifurcated, and one big rectangular strip of island became three triangles. Uh, After that, I went there 10 years after the tsunami. By then, it was becoming a very rich biodiverse place, including in Great Nicobar Island. The impact of the tsunami was such that, again, perhaps because of the mineral content deposited by the tsunami, who knows, the place has become so rich in biodiversity. And there's also a negative effect. Many islands, smaller islands, got swallowed up. They sank into the ocean off the coast of Great Nicobar Island. A couple of islands sank into the sea and never to come back to the surface. But then those islands have lost a lot of bird population. The megapode, there was an island called Megapode Island that submerged into the sea and we've lost it. But there are a lot of very rich biodiversity that have shown up in tsunami affected places. We can study about the positive effect of tsunami, if at all, in a chapter called The Impact of the Tsunami on Biodiversity and Zoodiversity. There I will come up with a lot of anecdotes and examples to extrapolate. But yes, those geological calamities like volcano, earthquake and tsunami, they do have a bearing on the biodiversity and the ecosystem. Whether it's positive or negative is a matter of extrapolation, how people interpret it. Uh, so that's a matter of interpretation only. Even agriculture becomes, this is another positive thing. In Nicobar, people were not used to tilling the land. The Nicobarese were dependent on fish. They used to cook rice. They used to pluck one coconut. They were not plucking a coconut. They used to collect fallen coconuts, and they used to collect the fallen pandanus or the breadfruit trees, mash it all up together, and with one fish. That was community eating, and that was their staple diet. Things changed after the tsunami. They started tilling because they got the scare of tsunami was such that they were scared of food security. So this is what the agriculture department says. They have now started tilling land. They have cultivating fruits and horticultural crops like fruits, vegetables, uh, which was not there earlier. And the agriculture department officials used to say no point teaching them things like spacing for planting, but now they do. Apparently they have started growing coconut in coconut plantations with spacing as a means, a scientific means. Earlier they were not doing any kind of cultivation. They used to collect fallen coconuts and fallen pandanus fruits. That was their staple diet: fish, rice, pandanus, and coconut. Things changed. Now they have a lot of fruits that are grown there, and it has helped to some extent. It has helped in agricultural trade. This is another thing. This tsunamis having a positive effect in Kamchatka in Siberia, for that matter, the Pacific coast of Russia, in Far East Russia. People are more used to hunting seals or many things, reindeer, for example. It's not easy for them to till land, cultivate crops, and consume agricultural commodities. They are more used to hunting. The people in Siberia, the indigenous people in Siberia. I think it was an FAO study which said people are found to have very rich amounts of riboflavin or vitamin B12, and they don't have vitamin A and vitamin A, B, C, D, which comes from agricultural produce. That is because of their lifestyle and they are more used to hunting animals and eating. So they have riboflavin, B12. They don't have so much of A, B, C, D and E. Vitamin A, vitamin B, vitamin C, and vitamin D or vitamin E are not so present in their bloodstream. So it has an effect. The fact that the Nicobarese have started agriculture as a means of livelihood is a positive effect, you could say. They now don't collect only the fallen coconuts. They have started actually climbing up the tree to harvest the coconuts. So if you call that a positive, it's a matter of your interpretation whether you call it positive or negative. If you go strictly by the traditional wisdom of islanders, maybe collecting coconuts is more sustainable. But if you were to look at it as no, they have progressed, and if you have an evangelic attitude towards the indigenous people, and if you think you have changed the indigenous people, they now work hard, they till the ground, for agriculture, they now collect. They don't just collect, but they actually harvest and coconut. It's a matter of interpretation, but it has happened, for good or for worse. There is a dossier. What has not happened is tsunami water has created a huge slush, and there has been no attempt, at least by the Indian government of India's Department of Agriculture in Andaman Nicobar Islands. They have not done anything for soil restoration. Tsunami water ravaged the soil, and topsoil was inundated. It is still infested with minerals, if you want to call it that. It has not been, the soil nutrition has not been restored. That is a necessary intervention. I think I mentioned that in this book reading, today's book reading, at the end. There was a photograph too. I do not know if it came out I have to concentrate on the book reading. I only prepare the photographs for the slideshow. My teammate, Mr. Prasad, he mounts the pictures on the slideshow. How it gets timed in synchronicity to my speech, I do not know. If it is there, good. Otherwise, I shall use it again in the next chapter. But soil nutrition's restoration is a must in any such geological calamity, or in the areas impacted by such geological calamities. I think even after the Japanese tsunami, large areas were contaminated by tsunami water, and it was rendered infructuous. Do's and don'ts during tsunami and after tsunami. Now, this is something that protocols have been given. Against, it's part of the standard operating procedure. It has to be publicized by the media. I can do one thing in the next book chapter, next book reading, next episode. I shall read out the do's and don'ts. It is part of the standard operating procedure. And as far as awareness for the common man is concerned, as regards do's and don'ts, I shall refer if there is in my book, and I shall publicize it next week in the next week's book reading. That's very interesting. Thank you. But the state governments, which are or the chief secretaries of the state governments and the union territories, they do a good job of monitoring because they have the entire standard operating procedures lined up department wise for them. And the chief secretary's job it is to monitor the situation and check the do's and don'ts and the checklists, etc. It's not easy at all. It's a thankless job. But since India has drawn these protocols and has put these things in place, at least the steel structure of the Indian government or the Indian state, that is the bureaucracy, they take over. They make it seamless. That is when we have to thank them. But we've also seen extremely corrupt elements. There was one official in Great Nicobar on the day of the tsunami, or rather the day after the tsunami, when a shipment full of rice came. Apparently the AC and the SP, that is AC is Assistant Commissioner and the SP is the Superintendent of Police. They got together, they picked up a sack full of basmati rice. They came to the bungalow, that is the APWD bungalow, and they were caught eating biryani. Whereas all the seawater infested rice bags were given to the islanders who had survived the tsunami. Can you imagine such horrible corruption? And then on the day of the tsunami, on the 26th of December 2004, apparently the then Chief Secretary of Andaman Nicobar Islands, he is the topmost official, just under the Lieutenant Governor. He was apparently having a Sunday evening chat with a visiting correspondent of the Hindu newspaper and a couple of journalists or something like that. And this guy said, "Please come over for a drink. From tomorrow we cannot have drinks for the foreseeable future." The Chief Secretary said that. Bingo, the Hindu correspondent or the Business Line correspondent that day published it. And I think the matter went straight to the Prime Minister's office that evening. And by 9:30 or 10 or 12 o'clock in the night on the 26th of December 2004, that Chief Secretary was transferred lock, stock and barrel to Arunachal Pradesh, and he was within less than 24 hours he was transferred. When the news streamed in orally by a correspondent, I think, of the Business Line, he called the Prime Minister's office and let them know that the officials are behaving like this. They wanted to have a drink with visiting journalists on the day tsunami has happened. Thousands of people have died. Can you imagine such shameless bureaucrats actually, man? They are actually paid not just salary but a pension in India. Such people have to be exposed. I can't even think of, I don't know how to react to such people. I get so upset when I see corrupt officials. But this happened. And these two incidents I have mentioned in my book somewhere. It's a huge book, but I have mentioned it somewhere, and I'm glad you brought it out. This is regarding do's and don'ts. I diversed to corrupt officials. But there are also extremely efficient examples of IAS officials and bureaucrats who have done an incredible job. I remember once in the April 11th, 2012 earthquake, which triggered a tsunami warning, uh, I had to write about it. And after I submitted my copy, my sub-editor, copy editor, had included that one very sensational sentence, that islanders were seen hopping across crocodile-infested creeks to safety when the tsunami warning had been issued. There are not so many crocodiles in so many islands. There are not so many creeks. There are only 2 islands which have a native population of crocodiles. So when I cross-checked this with the draft kept coming between me and the editor, and I cross-checked this with the then Chief Secretary of Andaman Nicobar Islands, one Mr. Shakti Sinha. He said, Malini, that's a pompous bit of imagination, nothing else. I couldn't do anything. My copy editor had inserted it. I really couldn't cross it out. But it could happen. Imagine it could happen. Because the terrain changes immediately in a calamity of this scale, in any geological calamity, the terrain changes immediately. Rivers change course. And then the sea invaded land in many parts after the Asian tsunami. One creek in a place called Magarnala in Campbell Bay in Great Nicobar Island of Nicobar district, which is the southernmost district or the southernmost island in Indian territory. Since sea has invaded land and it's become brackish water, there are crocodiles which are nesting there now. It's called Magarnala, or it's called Crocodile Creek. It was not a habitat for crocodiles before, but after the Asian tsunami, the crocodiles are now nesting in that place. People are scared to cross invading that creek on barefoot. It has triggered human-wildlife conflict. So these things happen. There isn't much you can do against a natural calamity, but run for your life to higher ground. That's one thing. But if there's no higher ground, if it's a flat land, as happened in Car Nicobar, the Karnik Island, the biggest island in, no, not the biggest island, it's the district headquarters of Nicobar district. Land is flat. It's more or less a quadrilateral island, and water rushed into up to 800 meters from all sides. It's a big flat land, so people perished. More than 1,200 or 800 people perished within 15 minutes in that island. That was tragic. So there was no higher land in Karnik to run to. And this thing we have heard about, people who knew, the indigenes knew that they had to run to higher ground, is a very romantic fallacy. Fantasy, I would say, not even fallacy. Because when I interviewed them, the Nicobaris told me, well, for us the traditional wisdom is move out of the tree cover area, so that if you go to, or constructed area, if you go to the beach, nothing will fall on your head. So we had been told to go to the open areas on the beach to protect yourself from falling debris. But then the tsunami waters came and they didn't know of tsunami. So it was this fantastic theory that they had traditional wisdom in them to run to higher ground. Neither was there higher ground, nor was there this traditional wisdom that they have to run to higher ground. They had to come to the open beach, according to survivors. Now there's one more question. Is there sufficient helicopters in Andaman Nicobar Islands for medical emergency and rescue team? There are helicopter services which regularly fly in the Andaman Nicobar Islands. They do prioritize medical emergencies, but there is no dedicated air ambulance in Andaman Nicobar Islands. Air ambulance is there in Lakshadweep. But in Andaman Nicobar Islands, every island is connected to Port Blair on helicopter, and they do prioritize any medical emergency. It could be labor, pregnant women in labor, it could be other emergencies. There was one person who had, I remember back in 2007, a person had suffered a rib fracture or a spinal cord injury, and he could not be airlifted for some reason. I think because of corruption, I suspect. But finally he was transferred, and I came by ship for the sake of adventure from Port Blair to Chennai. I traveled by ship. It was a 2.5-3 day journey. I had a good time. But when I saw that this boy had to be transported on the ship after 3 days on a ship after he had suffered a spinal injury, and before that he was in the GB Pant hospital for 10 days in, I think, in Port Blair. But he had, before that he came all the way from Rangat or Mayabandar in North Andaman. The poor boy had suffered so much and he had not been given priority. He could have been lifted on air flight, on a regular flight to mainland. Instead they put him on a ship and sent him to mainland for treatment. That was so tragic. But yeah, there are helicopters flying daily. For example, at all odd hours they're flying. And apart from civilian helicopter rides, the Indian Air Force is constantly on the lookout. Every 10 minutes a Dornier aircraft takes off from Port Blair. They have to defend the country. They keep going there. They keep monitoring. There is another chapter I have done only on search and rescue, and rescuing people who are fallen out of boats, or it becomes the duty of the defense in peacetime. And in 2014, when I was there, just then the MH370 had disappeared. And when I was traveling back from Great Nicobar to Car Nicobar, we had to do a lot of roundabout survey to see whether there was any debris in and around the islands of Nicobar. So helicopters do their duty, but for medical emergencies where they prioritize them, but there is no dedicated air ambulance in Andaman Nicobar Islands. And I have seen corruption with my own eyes. I have seen how they have misused and they have not prioritized a grave medical emergency, in that case of a boy who had to suffer so much because he was not allowed to go free on a helicopter. This is not what happens in Western countries. Human rights takes care of such things. Air ambulances will attend to medical emergencies in the Western countries, but not so in Andaman Nicobar Islands. It's a pity that the government servants sometimes are more equal than harrowing, much suffering islanders, or the native people who, or the politicians are so corrupt that they put suffering human population much behind their own egos. That's a tragedy, unfortunately. But then it also calls for better medical intervention in these far-flung islands. If there were fantastic medical infrastructure in these islands, they wouldn't have had the need to come to the mainland at all. So the need for high medical access, medical healthcare and medical interventions is necessary. I also mentioned in today's book reading, the Car Nicobar Island has a district general hospital which caters to some 13 islands in Nicobar district. Okay, they're sparsely populated, but having to come to the district general hospital from these far-flung islands during a medical emergency is unthinkable. There are two sides to it. This district general hospital is manned 24/7, and I, as a visitor in Nicobar, one day I had a cut or a bruise and I had to take a tetanus injection. So at 9:30 in the night, I went to the district general hospital saying I've had a bruise, I need a tet vac. Immediately I was attended, and there was no, it was sparsely populated. The duty officer was having dinner. Immediately after he finished his dinner, he gave me the shot. So, but then I'm a journalist. People will be scared to show their corruption with me. If this had happened to an islander, perhaps he or she would have been made to wait. But access is there, and the district general hospital has fantastic installations. It has the MRIs. No, I don't know if it has MRI, but it has X-rays units, and it has physiotherapy unit. I've seen it. I've seen a sports department in the physiotherapy unit. Then they have a blood bank, and they have HIV testing, and they have a lot of installations are there. And people are also making use of it. But coming from far-flung islands to just the district headquarters for this kind of medical emergency is a little hard. That's hard. Let's see what. If you have better such accessible healthcare in every island, then their resilience is higher. That's the point of disaster mitigation. Okay, we have been online for 55 minutes now. Another 5 minutes and then I'll have to turn off for today. Whether it is Andaman Nicobar Islands or Indonesia's far-flung eastern islands, or whether it is Lakshadweep Islands or Minicoy or Maldives or even Socotra in Yemen, access to healthcare in remote areas is necessary. We also know, apart from healthcare, we need evacuation, transport infrastructure, very good infrastructure for transport itself. And imagine evacuating people in from these island territories when there's a tsunami alert. Not just a tsunami. I mean, it can be any kind of ocean triggered calamities. On 11th of November 1987, if I remember, there was a huge tidal wave which hit the Maldives. Nobody knew whether it was definitely not a tsunami, and what triggered it remains a mystery. Uh, then there was this huge tidal wave which destroyed a lot of property in the Maldives. And those in 1987, there was definitely no tsunami preparedness, definitely not till 2004, much less in 1987. And it was not a tsunami, but it was a tidal wave, and it created havoc on the islands of the Maldives. They had to take the help of India back then to uh, treat the injured people and things like that. There is another question: is Japan better in disaster management? Oh yes, they have standardized protocols. They have mock drills very regularly conducted, so they know how to behave in case. So that's why when the Japanese tsunami happened in 2011, as soon as the warnings came, they knew that they had to go to higher ground, but they didn't expect that the tsunami would be 40 meters in height. So they didn't go so high. And it seems some people thought that whenever tsunamis happen in that part of Japan, it would come up to a particular point. They had expected the run up of the water to come to a particular point, but when it came far beyond, and they didn't have enough time, so they were waiting. They had not heeded the early warning sounded on the alarm to go to higher ground. Neither had the Japanese Emergency Management Agency warned them of a 40-meter high tsunami. It was that part of Japan, that is Sendai Prefecture, was prepared for eight magnitude earthquake, not a 9 magnitude earthquake. But a 9 magnitude earthquake will bring a tsunami far more inland than an 8 magnitude earthquake. This was what happened, and this is what caught the Japanese off guard, and that was why there was a 20,000 death toll. Usually, Japan, being one of the more developed countries, has the economic resilience, has the uh, infrastructure for early warning, and mock drill is a part of every day exercise in every office, in every household in Japan. Thus, they are capable of being more resilient. This cannot happen in the smaller island states of, say, Micronesia, Tonga, Bougainville, Papua New Guinea. They are not so resilient because they don't have the economic infrastructure for such high level of resilience. And these countries also suffer from pulverizing tsunamis. Well, for that matter, in the US is supposed to be very good in having standardized protocols for disaster mitigation. But when the Japanese tsunami of 2011 happened, and the tsunami warning had been issued, it was world news. But then one person, in all his enthusiasm or misadventure, stood on the Californian coast waiting for the tsunami to reach the Californian coast because he wanted to take a picture. He was the only mortality in the USA. But then this was you could not blame anybody because standard operating procedure had been effected, and tsunami warning had been alerted. But we don't know what made this gentleman stand on the beach to wait for a picture. I don't know if the selfie mania had conquered the world in 2011. I don't remember. But yes, it took a toll on him. He was the only mortality. People in Seattle, Washington, in Oregon, off the coast of Oregon, people are trained to run to higher ground when the next big one occurs. It's a constant drill by the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency of the United States. So the mock drills help. This is something that is lacking in India. We have standard operating procedure tested. In fact, we have a lot of early warning installations. We have scientific forecasting installations, but we do not have mock drill, which is found wanting in the current pandemic too. We don't. If the mock drill is done only by the authorities and people do not participate, people do not know what to do. Mock drills are very necessary. Fire hydrants, for example. How many of us will go and monitor the water level available in the fire hydrant on the street corner? That's an issue because in India, for example, the groundwater table has depleted. So there is no water level, there's not enough water reservoir in the fire hydrants. How many of us scrutinize these issues? How many of us are actually aware of this and how many of us are monitoring it actively? Which of us, I have done so much in disaster mitigation, at least in writing, but I have myself not been able to participate in neighborhood mock drills or neighborhood watch committees. When the pandemic lockdown was announced and it was the cops who were doing the march, fly past and march past, etc. We were not able to participate, and even if you were to participate in a march and a flag march of the cops, that doesn't take us far. Every single leader in every neighborhood has to be assigned responsibilities in disaster mitigation as part of the mock drill. Mock drills have to be done once a week. I don't think in India we do it even once a year. Except the NDRF, National Disaster Response Force, and their battalions, they do the mock drills. But what about the citizen participation? That's my worry. There is no citizen participation in mock drills. In Nepal, they do mock drills. In Bangladesh, they do mock drills. But India has advanced infrastructure for forecasting, early warning, etc. But we don't do mock drills. It's a very, very big lacuna. The administration has to be proactive in getting people to participate. Okay, we have gone well past 1 hour. I think I should call off because I'm going past dry in my throat. Shall we stop? Is there any other question? Nope. Let's stop for today. Please do join in for the next week's live chat after the book reading. Thank you very much for contributing to today's discussion. Have a nice weekend. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.